All right, there's no other questions, and we're going to cover chapter 22 with the rest of our time. So we're going to get into chapter 22. Let me put up the slides here. Takes me just a tad bit of time. All right, so everyone can see chapter 22 now. I guess you complain if you can't. So we're going to do chapter 22. There's not a lot of, we're not going to spend a lot of time in chapter 22. The homework will cover more material than I will. I apologize that it's just hard to cut the homework down. I cut some of it, but I want some of it, not all of it. It's just super hard with some of those questions to cut it down exactly. But what the slides will cover most everything that will be on the quiz for chapters 22 and 23. A lot of it we've talked about already, so it's not really new material. It's just kind of formalizing some of the material we've already talked about. So hopefully you'll kind of notice that right away. So with chapter 22, what it really does is it talks about this relationship between inflation and unemployment. And we've danced around it and we've talked about it, but it's just going to actually formalize that relationship. Okay, and then we're going to talk about what's the cost of reducing it, which we've hinted at. And we're going to talk a little bit about why inflation and unemployment were both low in the 90s. Okay. So there's two things to think about with inflation. And it runs right on holds true with the aggregate supply curves. So what we know about inflation and unemployment is in the long run, they're unrelated. Right? We've talked about why. Because in the long run, inflation is determined by the money supply. Unemployment is determined by the natural rate, which is, remember, structural and frictional. Has nothing really to do with anything besides structural and frictional unemployment in the economy. Right? Remember we talked about structural, minimum wage, unions, efficiency wages, and frictional, job search processes. So in the long run, there is no relationship between the two. They're not related. However, in the short run, we can look at it through aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply, and we see that it's possible that there is this relationship between inflation and unemployment. So the very first idea about this relationship comes from a man named A.W. Phillips. And all A.W. Phillips did is he said, where's my pen? All A.W. Phillips did says, boop, 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 boop. Oh, look at the relationship between inflation and unemployment. It's negative. That is about all he did. Oh, he said, look, in the UK, from about the 1880s into the 1950s, look what I see. Here's what the picture looks like. Two individuals, Samuelson and Solo, did the same thing in the United States. And they gave credit to Phillips because he first illustrated this relationship. He said, well, there looks like to be this trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So what can we do about it? So he says, well, it really comes from the aggregate demand short run aggregate supply curve, right? So we're at point A, and all of a sudden aggregate demand increases. So if aggregate demand increases, that means inflation went up, unemployment went down. Why did unemployment go down? Why? Because GDP increases. So we've talked about this kind of indirectly, right? We talked about as GDP goes up, inflation will increase, and unemployment goes down. So that's all Phillips found. So because he found this, he said, well, if we know this relationship holds true, then there is ways for policymakers to try to get low unemployment and high inflation, or low inflation and high unemployment, or some combination between. And so he says there's this options that policymakers can try to do to affect the economy. And in the 60s, this was all the rage. There was lots of data that supported this idea that the Phillips curve was a good thing and policymakers could take advantage of that. So you see you almost see the little downward sloping line there. Boom, perfect. It seemed to work. However, in the 68, and there's two economists, both of them Nobel Prize winners, said, well, this is just a temporary thing. We shouldn't expect to see this in the long run, because we know in the long run that these two things aren't related. That in the long run, unemployment should move towards the natural, and inflation should move based on money supply. And so what the Friedman-Phillips curve looks like is it looks like long run aggregate supply. Is that here's the unemployment rate, here's inflation, this is the natural rate, corresponds directly to the natural rate of output. And so if aggregate demand moves, that's just creating higher inflation. So if we increase money demanded in the long run, all we're going to end up with is higher inflation. It's not going to be able to change our natural rate of unemployment. So remember, the word natural doesn't always mean socially desirable, but it's also, the book uses that term, and I'm not so sure I agree with it, because socially desirable is kind of a bad term. It depends on how you believe of government. If you believe that the people elect the government to set our policies determine the natural rate of unemployment. And if we believe that we have the right government officials, then we believe that that is a socially desirable place of unemployment. If you believe government officials do what they want and set policies that are bad for the economy, then they may not set the socially desirable rate of unemployment. Because the policies they create unemployment. Because remember, structural comes about either through minimum wage, unions, or efficiency wages. And government policies can influence each of those, right? And we also have a job search. How easy is it to find a job is also influeed by government policy. So the government policy influences all of the natural rate. So a lot of it is government influenced. They don't set the rate, they just set the policies that help influence the rate. So that's why the natural rate of unemployment isn't the same in every country. In the United States, it's right around 5%. However, in Europe, it's closer to 8%. So each country has its own natural rate of unemployment. And I believe, if I remember my statistics right, in Japan, it's like 3%. So each country has its own natural rate of unemployment based on its government policies. And their government policies is never based on money. That influences inflation. So we have the 60s. Remember, everything looks pretty. There's their equation. Now let's add in the 70s. Late 70s. Where's that down? Now it's almost even kind of upward sloping looking. And so they quickly said, yeah, you just happen to find the right period of data to tell your story. When we add 10 more years, that isn't the story the next 10 years. That doesn't give us that nice downward sloping line. So there kind of says, well, is the Phillips curve really existing, or did you just happen to pick the right data points to tell your story? So what economists have come to is we're not positive exactly how the Phillips curve operates. We know in the long run there is no Phillips curve. We still think, or still have this idea that it's probably possible in the short run. However, the short run, as we think, is maybe a year or two. And it's going to be hard for government to have influence on the short run. But there does seem to be some relationship between aggregate demand shocks and output falling and unemployment rising. So the book uses a term which it calls disinflation. Disinflation is a reduction in the inflation rate. Okay, so remember, deflation is actually a negative inflation rate. So those aren't quite the same terms. Okay. So deflation doesn't mean the inflation rate is negative. Disinflation means we went from a 3% inflation rate to a 2% inflation rate. So what economists have found, though, is they found something they call the sacrifice ratio. This was big in the 80s. And so the economists found that if you let inflation get out of control, or if inflation gets too high, it's going to cost you GDP to reduce your inflation. And the estimates they find is it's going to cost you about 5% of GDP to get inflation down by 1%. So that's why there's this big push right now is if the US goes over 2%, which we find to be kind of the limit, how high we're above 2%, remember it's going to cost us 5% of GDP to get us down. So that's why economists worry that if we get to 4% inflation, there's going to be a steep price to pay for that. Right? It's going to cost us 10% of GDP, right? Because we're going to get down 2. So we want to lose 2% inflation. 2% times 5 gets us 10% of GDP. So there's a sacrifice that's going to have to occur if GDP gets too hot. So that's why there is this idea and this look at and worry about inflation getting too much, because we know if inflation gets too high, there's a cost to it. And the cost to get it down will be GDP or output. Or really, if you want to look at it, it will be unemployment for a little bit of time. We saw this most prevalent in the 1980s, especially the 1982 recession. The 1982 recession was we flushed inflation. In the 1980s, inflation, we could see anywhere of up to 10% a year. So remember, if we think about that being the interest rate and the nominal interest rate, that means people were borrowing money at somewhere around 15% a year to buy a house. So mortgage rates of 15%. That's quite high, considering if you look at mortgage rates today, are usually somewhere between 5 and 7%. Remember, mortgage rates will determine how much house you can buy. So as I said, in the 1982, there was the chairman, Paul Volcker, and he tried to move inflation down, and he did, from 10% to 4%. But as I said, that came at a cost of high unemployment. That's sometimes referred to as the Volcker recession of 1982. There's the recession. Right, we got inflation down, but unemployment shot up pretty good. We have a recession here too, and that's when sometimes they refer to as a double dip recession. We had a recession in 80, so to about 80, 81, and then we get another recession. And then finally, after 83, life looks a whole lot better. The Greenspan era, they referred to as the Great Moderation. And if you look at the periods here, I said after Volcker pretty much cleared it out, we have pretty good economies. We never get to 8%, and we're almost always below 4%. So we're almost in both an era of low inflation and low unemployment. Yeah, a lot of your parents probably grew up in the 90s. And those were actually very good economic times in the United States. Right, so even if we use the more traditional ways of right about here, 5.5% and 2, look at how much of the 90s and the 2000s were well below that number. So we had some very good times during those time periods. So a couple of things to point out about Chapter 22. As I said, we're not getting to everything. Inflation, unemployment, unrelated in the long run, negative related in the short run. And there's some expectations that kind of play an important role in adjustments. All right, are there any questions in about Chapter 22?